Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning in to the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. This week I had a great conversation with Dr. Cesar Padilla about his work bridging subspecialties between critical care and obstetrics to be able to tackle the problem of maternal mortality in the United States. I learned in the course of this conversation the United States is head and shoulders above other developed nations in terms of maternal mortality and morbidity. And it's a problem that is very stubborn. There's a lot of new and exciting ways that Dr. Padilla is tackling this with some of his colleagues. We had a great conversation about that and some other key principles that have guided his formation as a professional. So I think you're really going to enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to episode 83 of APM Success. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Cesar Padilla. He is an anesthesiologist and he's also completed ACGME fellowships in critical care as well as obstetrics. And he comes from a really interesting place intellectually with this idea of cross-pollination that I'm really excited to talk about today, in combining these different disciplines in some ways to solve big problems and old problems in new and exciting ways. So Dr. Padilla, thanks for joining us today on APM Success.
Justin, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And I'm excited for us having an exciting conversation. So thank you again for inviting me.
And so a mutual friend, Dr. Karen Seibert, introduced us recently, and Dr. Seibert's been on the show a few times. Tell us a little bit about how you know Dr. Seibert.
So Dr. Seibert is, well, I just want to start off by saying she's an amazing mentor, and she's someone who just stands out in my career. She was a staff anesthesiologist at Cedars-Sinai. I believe she's now at UCLA, but that's where I did my residency training in anesthesia at Cedars-Sinai. And it's a unique place to train because it's an MD only practice. And so as an MD only practice, which for people out there who are sort of not familiar with anesthesia residencies, MD only practice means that you have one physician in the OR with that resident. And that's really uncommon. What you have mostly across the country are CRNA. You have a physician overseeing multiple OR rooms. So it could be, there could be a CRNA in that room, or there could be a resident in that room. But training in a MD only practice was key, because imagine you get paired up with the physician all day and they sort of become your mentors, and every single minute of that day, there are opportunities for education. And Dr. Seibert, what struck me about her is how she really understood things from multiple sort of levels. She understood that we're not just physicians. She understood that we're part of something bigger. We are physicians are uniquely integrated into society as leaders, as scientists, as writers. And she influenced me in a lot of ways. I would, just sitting here talking to you, I would say that one of the influences is the power of writing. I started writing for Kevin MD, the popular social media sort of website for physicians. And that a lot of that inspiration came from Dr. Seibert, because she's a great writer. So, I would say she's more of a life coach, and she's, she helped me get an OB fellowship and put me on that track. But yeah, she's a great person.
Yeah, so tell me about that. The OB fellowship and critical care as well. At what point did you decide that you were going to do so much ongoing specialization?
Yeah, so that decision came from other mentors at Cedars-Sinai. Another person is Dr. Mark Sikowski. So Dr. Mark Sikowski is, actually, it's funny, as I'm telling you this story, there are a lot of similarities with Dr. Sikowski and Dr. Seibert. Both of them were presidents of the California Society of Anesthesiology. And I don't think that's a coincidence. That's awesome, right? Imagine working in a place as a resident, and like these two attendings that you rub shoulders with are basically like, presidents of the California Society of Anesthesia. And if you take a step back, like California is the 5th largest economy in the world. I mean, this is no small feat. They're basically like presidents of societies of countries. And Dr. Sikowski is trained in obstetric anesthesia. He did extra training in that. And he's the current section chief. Or when I was there, he was certainly the section chief of OB anesthesia. And he would tell me, you have to think about the evolution of the field of anesthesia. The walls of the OR limit you. And that's really true. And just think about it just conceptually. In an operating room, you're locked in a room. If you're out there walking around, whether you're in the ICU, you're doing OB, you're being seen. Your engagement is different in the hospital. And plus, it's a good balance in your life. So he was a proponent of doing a fellowship. And he told me, he was like, look, we have a problem in obstetrics, which is there's a rise in morbidity and mortality. There is a need for critical care skills. And our fellowships are only 1 year. It's a great investment for all of you out there who are interested in medicine. I would say this with zero, I stand 100% behind the following statement. Obstetric anesthesia is the hottest fellowship. And I'm going to probably go into a few reasons why that is, because I'm assuming you're going to ask me, Justin. And he put me on that path. But the extra little twist was to do a critical care fellowship. So I went into, so I graduated Cedars-Sinai, went to Boston. I was at Brigham and Women's, where I met amazing people. Again, the power of mentors. I mean, we have to highlight the power of mentors here. I met people with that same sort of vision of the field, people that wanted to pick me up and support me at Brigham and Women's. And, I went there with a plan to do 2 fellowships. So I did both of my fellowships, did OB first in 2017, and then 2016, wow, so, I can't even remember, I'm getting that old, 2016 in OB, and then 2017 to 2018 in critical care. But and this speaks to generational sentiment. We know that millennials, and I'm proud of this, that's my Twitter handle, MillennialMD, we identify with a sense of purpose in the workplace. We want to work for companies that have a sense of, that provide meaning, that have a sense of commitment to our communities, that, we stand behind the ethos of our CEOs. And, we see that universally. You're wearing a Nike sweatshirt. Nike is one of my favorite brands, and I stand strongly behind their message of like social justice and things like that. And when Dr. Sikowski put me on the path for OB critical care, it was a path of purpose to address a specific need, which is a need for awareness a need for solutions in addressing critical care and obstetrics and a rising morbidity and mortality. Women are more likely to die now than they were 30 years ago in the US, and patients are getting sicker. And so I think that was really, it was a sense of purpose. That's really the lifelong energy that Dr. Sikowski gave me. And I would say the people at Brigham and Women's, what they gave me.
There's a number of statistics in American healthcare that are mind-boggling in their illogicality. I'm pretty sure I made that word up. And I think that this has to be one of the foremost of these statistics. The fact that maternal morbidity and mortality has been going backwards. And if you compare us to other developed countries, the magnitude of the difference, and then and that's true in absolute terms. And then if you look at it in terms of spend, it's insane. So I'm sure this is a complex and multifactorial problem, but can you maybe briefly describe a couple of those, whatever the high coefficients are with this challenge that we're facing?
Yes, absolutely. This is why obstetric anesthesia is the hottest fellowship, because we have this problem that is very unique to our field. And so before I really get into the answers, to answer your question in detail, I really want to highlight the setup. The setup is that, if you think about cardiac anesthesia or pain and, pain management, you have to think about the sort of the background setting up those fields. What's happening in obstetrics is unique because, well, first of all, it's 2 lives. So you have or can be multiple. It could be, but you have the life of the mother and developing baby. But you really have sort of to me, what pregnancy represents, it's really it's almost like the sanctity of a society. And you have this problem that is unique in or in obstetrics, which is an acute rise in morbidity and mortality. So to answer your question, there is an increase in complexity in patients. And a number that certainly stands out is if we were to take the ICD-10 codes that sort of detail severe maternal morbidity. So severe maternal morbidity is basically end organ dysfunction. So you think about ARDS, acute renal failure, things like that. That, as an intensivist, that's how we view the body. We view the body in organ systems. If we look at ICD-10 codes, so I believe for severe maternal morbidity is 2022, they have gone up 200% from the 1990s into the 2013, 14. 200%. The top cause of mortality in obstetrics is cardiac. It's cardiovascular. And if you take those numbers and then you compare them to sort of what's happening in Europe, the mortality has not necessarily risen. Now, and I'm talking about the industrialized world. I really want to make that distinction for your listeners. We're not talking about the sort of developing world. We're talking about the industrialized Western, the United Kingdom and the United States, just for purposes of simplicity. In Europe, patients are also there is an increase in mortality from cardiac related. Sepsis is the leading cause of death, but we just don't see that aggressive trend in mortality that we see in the US. But behind that mortality is the fact that upon review of these maternal deaths, the majority are preventable. So up to 60% of maternal deaths are preventable. And if you look at specific causes like sepsis, up to 70% or upwards of 70% are preventable. And so here you have this very unique problem, Justin, right? You have this problem where patients are getting sicker. We as anesthesiologists are uniquely trained to really understand the body and to really deal with critical illness. That's our job. Our job is to deal with emergencies, basically, under anesthesia or if you're a critical care trained anesthesiologist, whatnot. And so our skill sets prepares us uniquely for this setting. And then you have this preventability. You have a preventability of maternal death, and the deaths are the tip of the iceberg. Imagine, underneath each maternal death, I believe the statistic is 50 to 100 cases of near misses or severe maternal morbidity. So you're really, there's really a problem here that we're sort of all addressing. Or we're certainly trying to address, but this is the beginning of something new. So the way I see it, I tell residents, is this is a new field. It's really this unique combination of critical care and obstetrics. And just because no one is talking about it at your hospital doesn't make it a new field. That's the key. Just because they're not talking about it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Because, as anesthesiologists or anesthesia residents, and I'm sure a lot of residents can sort of attest to this, the first thing you hear is like, oh, you see a lot of your buddies doing pain management or cardiac. You may not hear that a lot about OB, but it's because a lot of the sort of the novelty of OB, it just became ACGME so accredited, I believe 10 years ago. And there's a novelty to it, but I'm giving you an inside view into the secrets of OB, why it's the hottest fellowship. And, for me, it was the drive to address maternal morbidity and mortality, and sort of a lot of these problems that are attainable certainly within our lifetime. I mean, there's no question about it that we can develop algorithms to capture these patients, and we'll go into some of these things and we have tools now that can screen for patients at risk of clinical decompensation. It's an exciting time.
Absolutely. I'm curious, during the course of you sort of considering a second fellowship, or maybe even slightly before, were there any patient interactions or experiences that perhaps sort of overlaid on top of your mentor's exhortation that really solidified this for you?
Yeah, absolutely. There was this case, and I did a case report on this. So just for full disclosure, I have all the, when we presented the case report, you have to get permission from the patient. We had a patient who was otherwise healthy, and she developed a postpartum or peripartum cardiomyopathy. So she had acute heart failure. It was, we ruled out other causes. It was not an amniotic fluid embolism. It wasn't a clot, wasn't a PE. It was essentially, once you exclude other causes and you have an EF below 45%, you have the diagnosis of peripartum cardiomyopathy. And I believe her EF was 10 to 15%. It was severe. And Cedar Sinai Hospital in LA is the #1 hospital for heart transplants. I believe it still holds that title. I know we used to have little pins that had the number of heart transplants done. I think it was like 140 something. So I was lucky. I was lucky that I was in a center that was the champion in the world of heart transplants. And this woman who delivered went into acute heart failure. She had flash pulmonary edema. We intubated her, and she ended up getting an Impella. So an Impella is a left ventricular assist device, which is basically a device that's floated through the arterial system. It sits in the left ventricle, above, in the chamber of the left ventricle, and it basically sucks out blood and it promotes offloading of the ventricle. And as and we call it non-invasive because you don't have to have a sternotomy to get an Impella. So it sucks blood out, uses a little motor to then expel blood into the aorta. So it augments the heart. And she recovered within 4 days. She basically recovered to a normal ejection fraction. And that was, I believe to this day, we wrote it up, submitted it to the journal, it was published. It's the first case of an acute improvement after an EF that's severe using an LVAD. And that just really opened my mind because I was like, wait a minute, here I am, I'm a resident, right? So let's talk about this, put this into perspective. I'm a resident and I just published the first case report of like an acute, of a fast recovery, because most recoveries with that bad take months to recover. And so I was like, oh my God, like there is so much that is unknown. So much that is unknown. And that reality, first of all, it's humbling, but it's for me, it's like putting puzzles together. This is the opportunity we need. We just found the fact that patients with preeclampsia and severe features have diastolic dysfunction. This is new stuff. We don't have standardized ways of identifying diastolic dysfunction or pulmonary edema in pregnancy. This is stuff that is going to happen in our lifetime, and it's going to be things that we develop with our colleagues in maternal fetal medicine, et cetera. So that was the case. It was that case of peripartum cardiomyopathy where the patient had an LVAD at Cedar Sinai. She got better. It's amazing. And and that was a CA1 then. So those encounters, they leave an impression. And I still remember the patient's name, and that's how strong it is. But that would be the case. There's no question that set that in motion, that sort of intersectionality of cardio, critical care, obstetrics, or those fields, cardiac, critical care, and obstetrics.
You mentioned when we spoke the other day this idea of regionalizing care, and you told me a little bit about how it works with transplants, and which was all new to me. I didn't really know how that works. So maybe take a minute and kind of describe how that works and how a similar system may be enacted to really help significantly curb some of these statistics.
Right. Yeah. So it's amazing how lucky I was to be at Cedar Sinai, because the chair of obstetrics there is one of the, I'm blanking on her name right now. Maybe you can Google her name for me. But she is one of the leaders in the field of OBGYN. And she was one of the authors of this document called The Levels of Maternal Care. And the name is like right in my head.
Is it Dr. Kirkpatrick?
Yes, I was going to say Klein goes with the K, Dr. Kirkpatrick. So, Dr. Kirkpatrick was one of the authors of the Levels of Maternal Care, and this document is one of the most important documents, I believe, in the last 25 years in medicine. It's a document that says if you have a sick patient, a sick pregnant woman, you really need to think about which hospital she delivers at, because and it just, that statement makes so much sense on
Yeah,
so
it
many
does.
levels. It's simple, right? It's simple, but sometimes the best questions or the best statements are simple. So how do you do that? Well, you have to take into account their comorbidities. Okay, a patient who has a history of CHF, a history of renal failure, a history of autoimmune disease, a history of, that is not the same as a patient who has no comorbidities. And so what what the levels of maternal care did, and this is the statement, by the way, that was sponsored by our societies, the ASA and the Society of Obstetric Anesthesia and Perinatology, SOAP, we sort of sponsored it, was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you have to regionalize care. And the data, we know that if sick patients or patients with a higher complexity deliver at lower acuity, lower sort of, or hospitals with lower resources where they do less deliveries and things like that, there are worse outcomes. Think about the patient I just presented, a patient who went into, heart failure. I mean, first of all, you need to have a cardiothoracic surgeon basically there to put in an Impella, like, emergently in the cath lab. That's not going to happen. And granted, she had no risk factors. However, that really speaks volume to centers who have these resources. So how do you funnel these sick patients to these hospitals? So in my mind, what makes sense is you think about you think about the transplant sort of committees. So the transplant committees work by regionalizing care. So the US is sort of divided into segments. I don't know exactly the segments, but let's just say Northeast, Midwest, whatnot. And if you're on a transplant list, well, you live in a certain, designated area of the U.S., and your chances of getting an organ are essentially a little different than whatever if you live in another place in the U.S. And I remember this because I did a surgical intern here at Cedar Sinai. Our year was we did a lot of surgery, so it was like, and that was when I was on the liver transplant unit. I remember flying out to as an intern, we would fly out to like your designated states around LA to go pick up organs, basically. But why can't we do the same with pregnancy? Here we have a process of pregnancy. In most cases, it's a 9.5 month process where you have time to plan. You have time in the antenatal setting. You have time to send a patient to identify sick patients. We have tools. One of my mentors at Brigham and Women's, Dr. Brian Bateman, invented a tool that screens for patients in the antenatal setting. And this tool is able to predict with great predictive value which patients are going to decompensate. We have these tools at our disposal. And so really there's no reason why we cannot, at this point in time, why we cannot implement strategies and evidence-based pathways to send patients with an appropriate level of comorbidities to higher acuity hospitals. We should be doing that because the data supports it. And not only does the data support that, the levels of maternal care dictates that, and so now you have our leading societies talking about this, and the next step is to implement it. But it's really going to be this nice cross collaboration of specialties. But that's how I think. And to me, that's how it makes sense. So it's like if a patient is pregnant, we should be able to track that. Okay, here's this patient with high complexity. Okay, these are the hospitals around where she lives. Okay, we're going to counsel her why it's important this patient delivers here. Why? Education is empowerment. Once a patient understands, okay, I am at a slightly higher risk of having a bad outcome because I am sicker, whatnot, when you account these comorbidities, placenta previa, all these things that we know we can account for, it's empowerment for the patient. It's empowering. And so now they know, and now they know why they have to deliver at a certain hospital. We're not there yet in the terms, the levels of maternal care don't dictate that yet, but we're heading there.
I mean, I'm thinking about a more like an embarrassingly simple example is like I'm here in West Philadelphia. We have the trauma hospital and essentially the non-trauma. So we've got Presbyterian on 38th and HUP on 34th. And if you're like bleeding out from a gunshot wound, you want to go to Presby because they know how to deal. They're equipped to deal with certain situations of a certain type of acuity, and all the teams there, they operate in a way that is cognizant of the nature of that medical situation. Whereas, at HUP, the infrastructure is not such that it's optimized to be able to handle those situations in the same way. And you take that sort of very simple example, and it makes perfect sense that we can then take every hospital around where somebody lives and stratify them based on who's equipped to be the level 1 trauma equivalent of the OB with all the comorbidities, and be able to direct them there. Especially, as you noted, we've got 9.5 months to think, or less than that, but we've got months to plan, and that makes all the sense in the world.
Absolutely. And I think when things make sense in your mind, I think as human beings, we can crystallize that vision, if that makes sense. It's almost like when we're being told something that makes sense, our mind naturally gravitates towards that sort of understanding. So I think about driving down the freeway and seeing a level 1 trauma sign. Why can't we have a sign for pregnancy, pregnancy related the levels of care? So the highest level, the highest complexity level is a level 4. So it works opposite. The numbers are opposite from the trauma classifications. But why can't I see a sign that says level 4 maternity hospital? We should. We should. I mean, we should. And our state representatives, our government is behind this. They are actively asking us to come up with ways to address maternal morbidity and mortality. And I really, I haven't really mentioned this, but it's, I want to highlight the burden of mortality in the African American population, in the Native American population. This is really key. African Americans are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications. Native American women 2 times more likely to die. That subject in itself, the inequalities, the racial inequalities, is a whole different. That would be, a whole episode on its own. But we need to mention that here. This is part of the strategy. Part of the strategy is to really identify sick or identify women ahead of time when they're pregnant and send them to appropriate level hospitals. Just like when we're driving down the freeway, we see a level 1 trauma center right next to that sign. Equally, it needs to be the maternity sign. And I think we're close. I think we're there. It's just going to take a little bit of vision and, maybe just people just doing it.
Yeah. Tell me about the idea. So we mentioned the idea of cross-pollinating between specializations, or sharing ideas between physicians coming from different places, or even like physicians and non-physicians. Talk about how that has opened up some of these ideas for you.
That's a great question, Justin. So cross-pollination, and I really believe that when you are in a new setting, when you're a little uncomfortable, your growth is exponential. You have to be uncomfortable. One of the best lessons I learned from Dr. Seibert, from Dr. Sikowski, is go to a different place for fellowship. Be uncomfortable, grow, be around people who challenge you. There's a great mentor, Dr. Bill Kamen. So Bill Kamen was he was a previous section chief of OB anesthesia at Brigham and Women's, and he taught me a lesson. This is so important for people to hear. When you're at your retreats, your professional retreats, for us, there are medical societies. Those are what we consider, where we catch up with all our buddies, and don't hang out with your own people all the time. Go sit at the table with the crew from Chicago, with the crew from LA, with the crew from Miami. Why be comfortable? Just go. You will learn things. But that little example speaks volume, because you can apply that strategy to your fellowship training, to your job. That is key. And one of the things that Dr. Kamen, it was during my fellowship year. I remember this conversation. This is fantastic. I mean, this is the way that I mentor residents, what he did on this day. It was the beginning of my obstetric anesthesia fellowship. And I told him I'm interested in critical care and echo, all this stuff. Without me saying anything, Justin, he looked up this critical care and obstetrics conference that's hosted by the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, which is an obstetric society. This is an annual course that's held at the University of Arizona, Banner University Medical Center. And I'm like, wait, Dr. Kamen, like, I can't go to that. I'm an anesthesiologist. And I remember the look on his face because he was like, so that's irrelevant. And I'm like, brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant because it's so true. So guess what I did? I went. Not only did I befriend the organizers they're like my professional colleagues. We've just published papers together, like Dr. Mike Foley, big shout out, past president of the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine. By the way, this society are the ones that wrote the levels of maternal care. So these are influential people in the field. But they invited me as an instructor. And so because of COVID, it was canceled, but this will be my fifth year as an instructor, ultrasound instructor, a critical care skill. And so I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Bill Kamen for having that sort of, that incredible perception and the intuition to really, to take a trainee and be like, just go to that conference. And he looked this up on his own. It's amazing. But that is the power of mentorship, And so we're talking about a lot of different themes here. We're talking about cross-pollination, the power of going, meeting with different professionals and mentorship. But it's all part of the same subject. It's all about get out of your comfort zone, do things that are a little different. And what I learned at this conference, at the Critical Care and Obstetrics Conference, what I learned is that there is an enormous interest in critical care and obstetrics. People from all different levels of training, nurses, midwives, OBGYNs, MFMs, residents, people from all different levels of training want to address this. They want more education in this subject. And so that was the big eye opener for me. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm definitely doing a second fellowship in critical care. When I was like, I'm definitely going to do it. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing, right? It's amazing. Like why limit ourselves to anesthesia societies? Go crash the critical care, crash the OBs, and the conversations that we have. I'm like, I never really thought about it because we each have a unique perspective.
Yeah. It's funny, and if you're listening to this instead of watching it, I have this big grin on my face, and it's hilarious to me, the translatability, not only between specialties in medicine, but between professions, because I'm living the reality of this as well. Like a couple of years ago, I basically stopped going to financial advising conferences because I kind of know the spiel, and there's obviously some things that we learn, but it's mostly just the opportunity to kumbaya with your friends, which is great. And that there's a lot of value in that too. But I basically, a couple of years ago, said, I'm going to go to anesthesia and pain conferences and get way outside of my comfort zone and just see what happens. And it has changed everything. And that's why this podcast exists. And that's why sort of my company has the flavor that it does. And it's really difficult and I still remember some of these first especially when you're the finance guy who goes to one of these medical conferences, and we already have this reputation, among doctors, and I'm just looking around and feeling so dumb. And it would have been easy for me to say, holy cow, that was super painful. I'm never going to do that again. But for whatever reason, I did see the value. I was convinced of the value. Not only for like what it would do for my business, but for me, like it's making me a better human. And I'm uncovering these unique problems and challenges and building relationships that's going to allow me to do something really unique and special. And so I'm just a huge believer in this principle. And I think the more we can encourage people to go to a conference where you don't know anybody that has maybe a tangential relationship to your expertise, but not directly like in your wheelhouse, that's where the new ideas are born. And that's really exciting.
It's up to the program directors and chairs of departments, because I think that the culture, the tone of a culture is set by the leadership. It could be there could be a disruptive innovation from the grassroots level, or it could come from the top where like the vision is shared. So for me, I was lucky that I had leaders at the top, like Dr. Sikowski's of the world and Dr. Seibert's and Dr. Kame and Dr. Bateman. These are people that enlightened me because of, they were sitting on the top looking out at society and how it was changing. They picked me up and were like, hey, look what's out there. But that's the power of, of having people like that in charge. That's why Dr. Seibert was the president of the California Society of Anesthesia. It's not a coincidence. It's not, Dr. Sikowski, it's not a coincidence. These people are in charge because they get it. They get it. And you're absolutely right. Like the power of cross-pollination, of intersectionality, another one is like technology. Like there is, the intersectionality of healthcare and technology. It's there. It's there. So like, I tell residents when they come on a service and we're working with a new set of residents, I tell them, question everything around you. Just because you show up to the operating room and you see things done a certain way, it doesn't mean that it's going to be done that way forever. And you really have to just question everything around you. Every single resident out there in any field of medicine, you have this value where you can team up with an engineer from Silicon Valley or an engineer from whatever, and you can create the next best thing. And we need to foster that innovation amongst residents. That's what we need to do. We need to be thinking about the future. We need to be letting we need to be mentoring, setting that fertile soil so there's new ideas, there's new things coming forward. And, I just can't help but think of technology. I think that technology is going to play a key role in that. Like, I remember when EMR came out and I'm like, why does this EMR look so ugly? Like, I'm sorry, but, because I grew up in California. So shout out to Silicon Valley companies, but like, I'm like, why can't I have an EMR that looks like my iPad? Right? Like, I want something simple and clean. I don't want this clutter that looks like an 8-bit video game from Nintendo system. I'm sorry, man, but that's not easy on the eyes. I don't want that. I want something clean. I want colors like Google or Apple. I want something like that. I mean, you walk into an Apple store, they're selling you a vision. It's not just about the product. They're selling you a vision. It's simple. It's clean. Why can't we have that in healthcare? Why does it have to be cluttery? Why does it have to be, all these administrative things that we know gets in the way? We know this. I mean, there's articles on this. Don't take it from me. Read what's out there. Look at there's a famous chart, of looking at, physician salaries compared to administrative cost or expenditure. And it's like administrative expenditure is like gone up thousands of %.
Yeah, I know exactly the one you're talking about.
Yeah, it's that. So, we're talking about sort of this unique sort of perspective that you get when you team up with different specialties.
So how do you think medical education needs to evolve in order to better facilitate this, create more of an environment in which this intersectional thinking is going to be able to happen, either spontaneously or in sort of a controlled environment, or just academic medicine in general?
So we have to understand what our problems are first. So one of our problems historically is that we are terrible at taking or at enrolling students from underrepresented ethnic, racial backgrounds. If you look at the percentage of Black and Latino physicians, it's abysmal. It really hasn't changed in the last 30, 40 years. I think last year there was a survey amongst physicians, and I believe only 3.9 or 4% identified as Latino or Hispanic, when Latinos are the largest minority group, and the demographic of Latinos is going to triple by the year 2050. And this is important, Justin, because you have to train people that are representative of your communities. You have to. Otherwise, you're living in this ideal world. You're living in this world where it's going to be this vicious cycle, and you're not going to go anywhere. You need to train people that are going to go back to their communities and be invested in their communities. If we have a problem with maternal mortality, if we have a problem with racial inequalities, we need to train people from communities or where people are suffering in those communities. This is fundamental. But this speaks to your question of innovation. That's how we do it. That's how we do it. So a way that I think about it is, well, not only taking students from underrepresented minorities, but including them in the inclusion of underrepresented leaders in positions of power, right? Because guess who's going to control the faucet for funding? So if you're sitting, if you're on I don't know, I'm just making this up here, but if you're on like a board of directors and you have the opportunity to swing a vote, it's like the Supreme Court. If you people are loyal to their constituents, are they not? I mean, sure, you have to think of justice, but like people are gonna, if you grew up experiencing poverty, you're more likely going to be, your mind is going to be working on innovative ways to address that poverty. And so that's what I think about. I think about, well, we have to take the right people first. And the other aspect of this is we have to take people from the right socioeconomic sort of distributions. Only 5% of physicians come from the lower quintile of socioeconomics, meaning their parents came from the lower quintile. The majority are from the top two. That's a problem, because unfortunately those statistics, the socioeconomics are also related to race and ethnicity. So that's a problem, because now you're really talking about, you're freezing out communities where a lot of these where the burden of medical disease is happening in minority communities. But this is how you start. This is how you start. We have to train of the right people. We have to serve. This is almost philosophical too, because if you think about a hospital, what's the purpose of a hospital? People, it's funny, right? Because in medical school, we never really learn about like the history of hospitals, or the history of like, no one teaches you that. Like what was the first hospital? Well, we actually took the idea from the French. Americans didn't invent hospitals. It was Benjamin Franklin's friend. His name was Thomas Bond. He was a medical student at the time. He was out in France, because France is, in the middle, literally. I mean, Europe is in the middle of the Enlightenment. He's out there, and he's in Paris, and this is a medical student at the time. Imagine being a medical student in the early 1700s. He's in Paris, and he sees this charitable hospital. It was called Hotel Dieu. So he's at this charitable hospital. Hospitals didn't exist then. This is the first one. And it provided care for free. It provided care for poor people for free. And guess who ran the hospital? It was the Catholic Church. It had philosophical inscriptions. The community. So that's not how medicine was practiced in the US. So he got back, and he was pretty lucky, this guy, Dr. Bond, because his friend was Benjamin Franklin. So, I mean, pretty lucky, So Ben Franklin was, he had that muscle, that political muscle. So what did he do? He's like, hey, man, this is a great idea for like treating people. If you put them in buildings and you call them hospitals, you can like pretty quickly, like, treat people well, and you can address a lot of our health problems, because there was a lot of breakouts of communicable diseases at trade ports. Philadelphia was a hub. So this is, he went back to Philadelphia, and Ben Franklin was like, yeah, let's do it. There was opposition from the elites. They didn't want to do it. Finally, he muscled through. They built the first hospital. Philadelphia. It was a Pennsylvania hospital. Yeah, Pennsylvania hospital in Philadelphia. First hospital with the same philosophical inscriptions as the Catholic hospital. So there you go. To everyone out there who is a physician or is thinking about becoming a physician, the first hospital that was built was directly inspired. We took the DNA from Catholic charity hospitals. Why don't we think about that when we think about the next steps and how to address our problems in healthcare? We don't. But it's funny, right? Because things are going to come full circle. It's like we have to understand who we are, our history, before we understand our future. We need to talk about this story. And that, by the way, that's important, because that's where the first medical school was built. It was an affiliate to that hospital. So it's like, this is the medical nucleus of the United States during its inception. And that guy, Dr. Bond, he also invented field hospitals for the Continental Army. So he has a pretty impressive resume. But this is what we need to talk about, man. We need to talk about like the history and why it's important to treat people. Like you should not go bankrupt if you're sick. That's not what our That is not what Dr. Bond with Benjamin Franklin had in mind. Oh, we're going to, U.S. citizens are going to go bankrupt when they're sick, you know. But that's really what we have to think about as we sort of think about innovation. Is we have to understand who we are, so we really get those creative juices going amongst students, and putting the right people in charge that are going to strike those creative juices. Once medical students are sort of enrolled, then I think to me a lot. I mean, you have to learn the basics, right? You have to learn your physiology and all that. But I think for me, like a natural next step for medical students and residents is pair them up with disruptors of like the technology. Like, what can you imagine? Like being paired up. Like imagine this. Imagine you're at a residency and everyone in their first year submits a project for like a technology project. For whatever. It doesn't matter if it fails. It matters that you went through the process because now you've been through it. And now the next time you have an idea, you're gonna link up and you go, oh, I went through it. I remember that. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, maybe we could do EMR this better way. Like imagine that's like your sort of like your project. Like every student or every resident gets paired up, or has this assignment of doing this. That's how we strike creativity. I mean, these are sort of these examples that I'm thinking about, but I think there's just so much innovation, and we have to tap into what motivates millennials, which is purpose. Purpose, a sense of justice for our communities. Like, if we tap into generational sentiments, so generational sentiment of purpose and working for meaning, I think we can get far.
Absolutely. And I want to close with this last question on this topic specifically. And you read this article, you mentioned Kevin MD. I want to link to this in the show notes, but it was called Who Will Inspire Millennials in Healthcare? This is from a few years ago now, but I think you're getting at this root issue of the inspiration and the why, and then bringing that into the present. And what you are seeing is, it sounds like there's a bit of a crisis of the why. And so I'd love to hear, what are you seeing, and what types of, what can we do about it in regards to the inspiration that millennials have in practice of medicine?
There's a lot of, I mean, we just look at the statistics. There's a lot of depression. There's a lot of, we're not talking about the elephant in the room, which is student loans. Okay. Millennials have on average 300% more student loans than our parents' generation. That's a problem. Because now that pressure, I mean, have we thought about the ethical pressure of having this immense amount of loans, of what types of decisions are those students going to make in choosing fields? Are we talking about that? What if there's a student that really wants to do family medicine, but that student's going to come out with $500,000 in loans? How, and then that student changes their mind. Are you going to blame that student? Is it ethical to basically assign a student or to mentor that student into a field where they're going to be, paying off their loans for whatever amount of time? So we have to talk about student loans. The other thing too is, what I think is going to inspire sort of millennials and certainly like Gen Z and the next generation is, so it's either going to come from within or it's going to come from the outside. So we're gonna look at fields like Silicon Valley. So I love Silicon Valley because in a lot of ways it flipped the business really sort of culture on its head. Even this concept professionalism. What is professionalism? What does that mean? Does it mean wearing a suit and a tie? Or does it mean telling the truth and being honest? I mean, I have different aspects. I mean, you know what I mean? Yes. So I think Silicon Valley, and imagine this, all right, Justin, just, really, let's think about the power of this idea. Okay. We all know about medical, like the administrative spending and, how much money is lost and stuff like that. I think we're only a matter of years before like an Apple or a Google who are rolling in profits before they're like, you know what? Why don't we just flirt around and just make a hospital? Why can't we do that? Why can't we just like make like a little city? Like, we'll have like a little example of a city and we'll just have a hospital and let's see what happens. We'll have entirely sort of built from within, built from on its own. And I think it's inevitable. I think that's what's going to happen. So it's either we change from the inside and inspire, the next generation and get them going in engaging with their communities, in addressing problems like maternal morbidity and mortality, other issues, or students are going to sort of have the side hustle. We talk about the side hustle of millennials. They're just going to go into other fields and they're going to leave medicine, or they're going to team up with other people, or what I think is also likely is that the disruption is going to come from external. Maybe Apple's going to build a hospital. I don't know. I believe that. Like, come on. When we were growing up, did you ever think Apple, which, I remember in elementary school, we had a little Apple computer. I think it was called Apple II.
Yeah, I remember the 5.5-inch floppies when I was in elementary school that we would run those programs on.
We never imagined that we're going to have phones, TVs, this and that. We're talking about Tesla, this is expanding. So this is inevitable, especially in the era of technology where access to technology or access to healthcare really depends on access to technology. So I think we're heading there. And from a sustainability standpoint, we can't spend this amount of money compared to other first world countries on healthcare without involving corporate sort of, or technology companies. We can't. Yeah, it's a great question, man. I love talking about this because it just has so many implications. Like the future is so diverse in sort of possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there? So I just one last question. What for yourself, if you think back to you've come a long way and you've learned a lot. I think very quickly. It sounds like you have like a whole lifetime worth of just wisdom that you've accrued in only the first handful of years as an attending. If you could go back and talk to yourself as a med student or a resident, and is there anything you would have either done differently or a way that you would have looked at the world a little bit differently, or something else that you want to impart to those who haven't had all these intersectional types of experiences that you have?
Wow. I think that's a great question. I think if I were to go back and sort of talk to myself when I was a medical student, let's say, I think I would have probably just told myself to really look for, just become more financially aware, financially savvy, investments and things like that. Because here we are. So America, the United States is the beacon of capitalism. You just turn on the TV and any news channel, you see the stocks at the bottom. It's everywhere. It's around us. Like, this is the beacon of capitalism of the world. Why is it then that doctors and medical students, the training of doctors, why don't we talk about this? Why aren't we talking about medicine? There's this huge discrepancy. Oh, it's, because we're in for pure, like, engineers don't also have a purpose. Apple engineers don't have a purpose. People who work for NASA don't have a purpose. They're allowed to talk about money, but doctors can't, especially when you're talking about the incredible debt over our heads and the fact that our culture is essentially a culture of capitalism. Like, how there's this discrepancy. So I would probably just tell myself, read books. There's a great book I want to highlight to everyone listening. It's Capital in the 21st Century. I have it somewhere. It's by Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist, and he breaks down the societies. He breaks down the economies of basically the Western industrialized world throughout time. He gives a really great perspective on how wealth basically was accumulated, the structure of the corporate structure. Just because things exist a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way. So I like an example that blew my mind is in Germany, like these companies like BMW, these companies, their executive suite are comprised of workers. Imagine having a law that mandated 50% of your executive suite is going to be workers. That's what they do in Europe. And we borrow a lot of their ideas in medicine. Like they invented the whole proning for ARDS, which is standard of care. Like they invented that and so like, yeah, they're pretty smart. Yeah, let's be humble here. Like we can learn from the Europeans. If they invented the democratization of the executive suite, guess what? It's only a matter of time before that idea makes it to the US. And the Roosevelt Institute, a progressive think tank, is already writing about this. They're writing about the democratization of the executive suite. We cannot have this aggressive mindset where it's all profits, profits, profits. We know it's bad. We know it kills morale. What you're just going to have stakeholders or shareholders in charge. No, you need to have stakeholders, which are basically another word for workers. You need to have workers in charge because those workers see the world through the people on the assembly line. That's, and so that's where I think like, a lot of the inspiration is going to come from this cross-pollination. Like I love reading about economists, like, or reading themes from economists from around the world. And it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation, which is just, get out of your comfort zone, just let's learn new things, So if that's what I would probably tell myself to read Thomas Piketty earlier on, because we really have to understand if we're in the beacon of capitalism, if we live in sort of the leading capitalist country of the world, we really need that proper education in medicine. We need to train doctors the right way because it's unethical. It's unethical to just string kids along into fields where then that interest is going to accumulate over their heads. But no, it's a great question, man.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap it there. Dr. Padilla, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for joining us on APM Success.
Absolutely, Justin. It was a pleasure. Shout out to all my mentors out there. I would not be here if it wasn't for all these people that I mentioned during the conversation. So thank you all. And thanks, Justin, for having me on.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.